Here's what most people miss. If someone doesn't choose you and you stay anyway, hoping, waiting, trying to earn what should be freely given, the suffering isn't coming from them anymore. It's coming from you. Not because you're broken or weak, but because you're doing something the Buddha warned against 25 centuries ago. He called it attachment. Not love, attachment. The quiet force that keeps you reaching for what's already gone, that turns care into craving, that makes you negotiate with reality instead of seeing it clearly. And here's the compassionate truth. You weren't taught how to recognize this. No one showed you the difference between loving someone and clinging to them. You're suffering not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're doing something human, something every person does until they learn another way. Tonight, 11 authentic Buddhist stories that reveal exactly what attachment is, where it comes from, and how it finally releases. Not harsh lessons, but mirrors, encounters with this same pain and the wisdom that transformed it. If it feels right, share where you're listening from below. The first teaching begins now. When someone doesn't choose you, your mind does something automatic. It starts searching. You replay the last conversation, looking for the moment things shifted. You analyze text messages for hidden meanings. You wonder if you said too much or not enough, if you were too available or not present enough, if you gave too much or held back too long. The questions multiply faster than you can answer them, and beneath every question sits one deeper ache. What's wrong with me? This isn't overthinking. This is suffering, trying to understand itself. And here's what makes it so exhausting. You're not just hurting from their absence. You're hurting from the story your mind is building about what their absence means. 25 centuries ago, a monk named Vakali understood this suffering in a way that might surprise you. Vakali wasn't rejected by a romantic partner. He wasn't passed over for a position or abandoned by a friend. Vakali's attachment was to someone who actually cared for him deeply, the Buddha himself. Vakali had become a monk for one reason. He found the Buddha's physical presence so compelling that he couldn't bear to be away from it. The way the Buddha moved, the calm in his face, the grace in his gestures, Vakali was transfixed. He would position himself where he could watch the Buddha throughout the day. He memorized every detail of the Buddha's appearance. His entire practice became about proximity to this one person. The other monks noticed. They saw how Vakali barely meditated, rarely studied, hardly engaged with the teachings. He was physically present in the monastery, but mentally consumed with watching, waiting, making sure he could see the Buddha as much as possible. Then something shifted. The Buddha began spending more time in solitude, teaching smaller groups, traveling to remote areas. Vakali's access to him diminished. And as it did, Vakali became ill. Not with a disease you could diagnose. His body grew weak from an ache that had no physical source. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't find peace anywhere. The monastery's physicians examined him and found nothing wrong, yet Vakali continued to deteriorate. He withdrew to a small dwelling on Vulture Peak, too sick to function, too consumed with longing to recover. When word reached the Buddha that Vakali was dying, he went to see him. Imagine that moment. Vakali, wasted from months of suffering, suddenly seeing the person he'd been craving standing in his doorway. The relief must have been overwhelming. Finally, after all that absence, here was the presence he needed. But what the Buddha said next changed everything Vakali understood about his suffering. Vakali, what is there to see in this foul body? The Buddha's voice was gentle but direct. This body is subject to decay, to death, to dissolution. Why do you waste your energy clinging to it? Then he said the words that would become one of Buddhism's most important teachings. One who sees the Dhamma sees me. One who sees me sees the Dhamma. Vakali had been suffering not because the Buddha was absent, but because he was clinging to the wrong thing. He thought he needed the Buddha's physical presence. He thought his peace depended on being near this person, on seeing him, on having access to him. But the Buddha was pointing to something Vakali had missed entirely. What he actually needed wasn't a person, it was understanding. The teaching wasn't in the Buddha's face or form. It was in the truth the Buddha embodied, the wisdom he taught, the way of seeing reality clearly that he demonstrated. All of that was available to Vakali, whether the Buddha was physically present or not. But Vakali had made the Buddha into something he needed in order to be okay. And that need, that insistence that his well-being depended on someone else's proximity, was creating his suffering. This is where the Buddha's teaching on dukkha becomes painfully clear. Dukkha is the Pali word, usually translated as suffering, but it means something more specific than just pain. It's the friction that arises when you insist reality be different from what it is. When someone doesn't choose you, there's pain. That's natural. Loss hurts. Rejection stings. Loneliness aches. These are unavoidable parts of being human, of caring about connection in a world where nothing stays the same. But suffering, dukkha, is what happens when you take that natural pain and add insistence to it. You insist they should have chosen you. You insist the connection should have lasted. You insist that their absence means something terrible about your worth. You insist that you can't be okay without them, that your peace depends on them returning, that life won't make sense until they see your value. Every insistence creates friction. Every should rubs against what is. And that friction, that constant mental argument with reality, is where suffering multiplies far beyond the original pain. Vakali's body was healthy. The Buddha still existed in the world. The teachings were still available. But Vakali had convinced himself that none of that mattered if he couldn't have the Buddha in the specific way he wanted. The suffering wasn't coming from the Buddha's absence. It was coming from Vakali's relationship to that absence. This is the part most people miss when they're not chosen. You think the pain is about them, their decision, their absence, their apparent indifference. And yes, there's real pain in not being chosen. That pain is valid. It's human. It matters. But the suffering that keeps you up at night, that makes you check your phone compulsively, that has you rehearsing conversations and analyzing every interaction that's not coming from them anymore. That's coming from what your mind is doing with their absence. Your mind is doing what Vakali's mind did. It's taking a person and turning them into a condition for your peace. It's insisting that you can't be okay without them choosing you. It's making their decision into a verdict about your worth, rather than information about compatibility, timing, or their own capacity. The Buddha told Vakali something crucial. This body is subject to decay, to death, to dissolution. He wasn't being morbid. He was pointing to impermanence, the truth that everything changes, including people, including feelings, including circumstances. When you make your peace dependent on something impermanent, someone's feelings, someone's choice, someone's presence, you're building on unstable ground. Not because the person is bad, or because caring is wrong, but because impermanence is the nature of all conditioned things. People change their minds, feelings shift, circumstances evolve. What felt certain becomes uncertain. What felt permanent reveals itself as temporary. None of this is personal. None of this is punishment. This is just how reality works. But when you don't understand this, when you take impermanence personally, it feels like something is wrong with you. Vakali thought something was wrong with him when the Buddha spent less time visible to the monks. He didn't understand that the Buddha was simply doing what the Buddha needed to do, teaching, practicing, responding to circumstances as they arose. The Buddha's schedule had nothing to do with Vakali's worth, but Vakali had made it about his worth. He'd made the Buddha's presence into proof that he mattered, and the Buddha's absence into evidence that he didn't. You might be doing the same thing right now. Someone's decision not to choose you might have nothing to do with your value and everything to do with where they are, what they're capable of, what they're seeing or not seeing in their own life. But your mind takes their decision and turns it into a story about what's wrong with you. The Buddha's response to Vakali wasn't to convince him that he was worthy of being watched. It wasn't to spend more time with him or validate his need for proximity. The Buddha's response was to point Vakali toward a different relationship with presence and absence altogether. One who sees the Dharma sees me. What the Buddha was offering wasn't more access to his physical form. He was offering something that couldn't be taken away by distance or time, or changing circumstances. He was offering understanding. Understanding doesn't require someone else's cooperation. Understanding doesn't disappear when someone walks away. Understanding doesn't depend on being chosen, validated, or confirmed by another person. Understanding is what remains when everything else becomes impermanent. And what Vakali needed to understand was simple but profound. His suffering wasn't being created by the Buddha's absence. His suffering was being created by his insistence that the Buddha's presence was necessary for his peace. The moment Vakali heard those words, "One who sees the Dhamma sees me," something shifted. The teaching says that he immediately understood, not gradually, not over time, but in that instant. He saw what he'd been doing, mistaking the finger pointing at the moon for the moon itself, mistaking the person teaching truth for truth itself, mistaking proximity to the Buddha for the peace the Buddha was pointing toward. And in seeing this clearly, his suffering ended. Not because the Buddha promised to be more available, not because Vakali's circumstances changed, but because Vakali stopped arguing with reality. He stopped insisting that his peace required the Buddha's physical presence. He stopped making the Buddha responsible for his inner state. He stopped demanding that impermanent things remain permanent. This is what the Buddha meant by the first noble truth, the truth of suffering's existence. Suffering exists not because life is unfair, or because people are cruel, or because you're not good enough to be chosen. Suffering exists because human beings have a tendency to cling to what's impermanent, to demand that changing things stay fixed, to make their peace conditional on circumstances they can't control. When someone doesn't choose you, the pain of that is real. You don't need to deny it or transcend it or spiritually bypass it. But the suffering that compounds that pain, the endless questioning, the self-blame, the desperate analyzing, the insistence that you can't be okay until they change their mind, that suffering is optional. Not easy to release, but optional. It's optional because it's being created by something you're doing internally, not by what they did externally. You're doing what Vakali did, taking a person and making them into a requirement for your peace, taking their choice and turning it into a commentary on your worth. Taking impermanence and treating it like permanence should have been possible if only you'd been enough. The teaching here isn't that you should stop caring. It's not that connection doesn't matter, or that loss shouldn't hurt. The teaching is that suffering intensifies when you mistake a person for your peace, when you confuse being chosen with being whole, when you make someone else responsible for your relationship with yourself. Vakali recovered, not because the Buddha started spending more time with him, but because he stopped needing the Buddha to be different than he was. He learned to access the teaching without requiring the teacher's constant physical presence. He learned to find peace that didn't depend on circumstances aligning perfectly. He learned the difference between appreciating someone and clinging to them. And in learning that difference, he discovered something unexpected: freedom. Not freedom from caring about the Buddha, but freedom from suffering over the Buddha's absence. Not freedom from wanting connection, but freedom from making connection a condition for inner peace. This is where the path begins, not in being chosen, but in understanding why not being chosen creates the specific suffering you're experiencing. Because once you understand the mechanics of your suffering, once you see what your mind is actually doing, that creates this friction, you have a choice you didn't have before. You can keep insisting reality be different, or you can start learning to meet reality as it is. One path leads to more suffering. The other leads somewhere unexpected. But first, you need to understand what attachment actually is and why the Buddha warned against it so strongly. Most people think attachment is love taken to an extreme. They think, I love this person so much that I've become attached. I care so deeply that I can't let go. My feelings are so strong that I'm suffering when they're not here. But Buddhism makes a distinction that changes everything. Attachment isn't love grown too large. Attachment is something else entirely. Something that often disguises itself as love, but operates by completely different principles. The Buddha had a half-brother named Nanda, who learned this distinction in a way he never expected. Nanda was engaged to be married to a woman named Janapada Kalyani, who was considered the most beautiful woman in the region. Nanda was deeply in love with her, or so he thought. When the Buddha returned to his home kingdom after his enlightenment, Nanda felt pulled to become a monk. Not from genuine spiritual calling, but from family pressure and social expectation. The Buddha was his half-brother, after all, and there was honor in following him. So Nanda ordained. He put on the robes, shaved his head, joined the monastery, and immediately became miserable. While the other monks meditated, Nanda stared into space, thinking about Janapada Kalyani. While they studied the teachings, he replayed memories of her voice, her smile, the way she moved. While they practiced mindfulness, His mind was entirely consumed with images of her face. He couldn't eat properly because longing sat heavy in his stomach. He couldn't sleep because desire kept him awake at night. He couldn't focus on anything except the aching absence of the woman he'd left behind. The other monks noticed. They saw him performing his duties mechanically, while his mind was clearly elsewhere. They heard him sigh at random moments throughout the day. They watched him grow thin and withdrawn, going through the motions of monastic life while suffering intensely inside. One day, Nanda made a decision. He would leave the monastery and return to her. The teachings didn't matter if he couldn't have her. Enlightenment meant nothing compared to being with her again. He'd tried the spiritual path and found it empty because it didn't contain the one thing he needed, her presence. He was packing his belongings when the Buddha appeared at his door. "Come walk with me," the Buddha said simply. Nanda followed, assuming the Buddha would give him a lecture about commitment or discipline or the importance of the spiritual path. Instead, the Buddha took him to a remote hillside where they sat together in silence for a while. Then the Buddha asked a strange question. "Nanda, when you think of Janapada Kalyani, what do you see?" Nanda described her in detail. Her beauty, her grace, the way being near her made everything else fade away. The Buddha listened without judgment, then said, "I want to show you something." What happened next, the ancient texts tell us, was extraordinary. The Buddha used his meditative powers to give Nanda a vision of the celestial realms where beings called Devas lived. And in these realms, Nanda saw celestial nymphs, beings of such stunning beauty that Janapada Kalyani, by comparison, looked like a burned old monkey next to a young woman. The vision was so vivid, so overwhelming, that Nanda's entire orientation shifted instantly. Suddenly, his obsession with Janapada Kalyani seemed absurd. How could he have been so consumed with longing for her when beings of such incomparable beauty existed? His craving didn't disappear. It simply transferred to a new object. "If you practice diligently," the Buddha told him, "you can be reborn among these celestial beings and have 500 of these nymphs as your companions." Nanda was elated. He threw himself into practice with intense energy, but for entirely the wrong reason. He wasn't seeking understanding or liberation. He was seeking celestial nymphs. His craving had simply found a new, supposedly superior target. The other monks noticed the change in his effort and asked what had motivated him. When Nanda admitted he was practicing to gain access to celestial nymphs, they mocked him mercilessly. They called him a prostitute's wage worker, someone practicing the Dharma for the sake of sensual pleasure. Nanda was humiliated, but more than that, something in their mockery cracked open a question. he hadn't been willing to ask himself. What was he actually doing? He'd been suffering over Janapada Kalyani, convinced that his peace depended on being with her. Then, shown something more beautiful, he'd immediately abandoned that craving for a new one. And now he was suffering again, this time from shame and from longing for beings he'd never even meet. The object kept changing, but the suffering remained constant. The Buddha, seeing that Nanda was finally ready, showed him one more vision. This time, not celestial realms, but hell realms. And in these realms of suffering, Nanda saw a massive cauldron being prepared. When he asked what it was for, the beings there told him, "This is being prepared for the monk, Nanda, the Buddha's brother, who is practicing to gain celestial nymphs. When his merit runs out, and he falls from the celestial realm, he will be cooked here for eons." The terror was visceral and immediate. But beneath the fear was something more important, a sudden, clear seeing. Nanda finally understood what the Buddha had been trying to show him all along. The problem wasn't Janapada Kalyani. The problem wasn't the celestial nymphs. The problem wasn't even the hell realms threatening him. The problem was craving itself. Tana, in Pali, the relentless thirst that kept demanding reality be different, that kept insisting happiness lived somewhere other than here, that kept making peace conditional on obtaining or avoiding something. Whether he craved his former fiancée, or celestial beings, or escape from hell, didn't matter. Craving, in any form, created the same result: suffering. This is what the Buddha meant when he taught the second noble truth. The origin of suffering is craving. Not desire itself, but a specific kind of desire, the kind that says, "I cannot be at peace without this," or "I cannot tolerate that." Craving has three forms, the Buddha taught. There's craving for sensual pleasure, the kind Nanda felt for Janapada Kalyani, and then for the celestial nymphs. There's craving for existence, the desperate need to be someone, to matter, to be seen and chosen and validated. And there's craving for non-existence, the wish to escape, to disappear, to not have to feel what you're feeling. All three operate the same way. They turn your peace into a transaction. They say, you can only be okay if you get this thing, or if you become this person, or if this situation finally ends. And because reality is impermanent and uncontrollable, that transaction sets you up for endless suffering. When someone doesn't choose you, craving disguises itself as reasonable thinking. It sounds like, of course, I'm suffering. They didn't choose me. anyone would feel this way. This is a natural response to loss. And yes, pain is natural. Disappointment is human. Sadness is a valid response to not getting what you wanted. But craving adds something extra. It adds the insistence that you cannot possibly be okay without being chosen. It adds the conviction that your worth is determined by their decision. It adds the belief that peace is impossible until they change their mind, or until you find someone else, or until enough time passes that you finally stop caring. Craving takes a moment of pain and turns it into an identity. You become the person who wasn't chosen instead of a person experiencing the pain of not being chosen right now. You make their decision into evidence about your fundamental value instead of information about this particular situation at this particular time. And once you've done that, you're trapped. Because now you're not just dealing with the original pain, you're dealing with all the mental proliferation that craving creates. The endless analysis, the self-blame, the comparison to others who were chosen, the desperate strategizing about how to become more acceptable, the bitter narrative about how you always end up in this position. This is what Nanda finally saw. His suffering over Janapada Kalyani wasn't because she was uniquely special, or because their connection was so profound that living without it was impossible. His suffering was because he'd made his peace conditional on having her, and when that condition couldn't be met, his mind created elaborate justifications for why he should continue suffering. When the Buddha showed him the celestial nymphs, Nanda's craving immediately transferred. He didn't need time to process or grieve or work through his feelings for Janapada Kalyani. The moment a more attractive option appeared, his supposed deep love vanished and reformed around a new object. This revealed something crucial. His attachment wasn't about Janapada Kalyani at all. It was about the craving itself, looking for somewhere to land. And craving is never satisfied. Even if Nanda had married Janapada Kalyani, the craving wouldn't have ended. It would have found new forms, craving for her to be different, craving for the relationship to feel like it did in the beginning, craving for the anxiety about losing her to finally quiet down. Even if someone chooses you, craving doesn't stop. It just changes what it's craving for. This is why the Buddha taught that the problem isn't the object of desire, but the relationship to desire itself. Love, in its pure form, doesn't demand. It appreciates without clinging. It values without controlling. It wishes well-being for the other person without making that well-being a condition for your own peace. Attachment does the opposite. Attachment says, I need you to be a certain way, so I can be okay. I need you to choose me, so I can feel worthy. I need you to stay so I can feel secure. I need you to love me in the specific way I want to be loved, or else I'll suffer. Notice the I need in all of those. That's craving speaking, not love. Love can coexist with loss. You can love someone and accept that they're not choosing you. You can value connection and simultaneously recognize when connection isn't reciprocated. You can feel sadness about an ending without making that ending into a catastrophe about your worth. But craving can't coexist with anything except getting what it wants. Craving is all or nothing, black or white, now or never. And because reality rarely gives us exactly what we want, exactly when we want it, in exactly the form we want it, craving guarantees suffering. After Nanda saw the hell realms, something fundamental shifted in him. He didn't try to replace his craving for celestial nymphs with craving for something else. He didn't attempt to force himself to stop wanting what he wanted. Instead, he started investigating craving itself. He began noticing how it arose in his mind, the sudden tightening, the mental reaching, the subtle or not so subtle demand that this moment be different from what it is. He noticed how craving always came with a story. I need this because, or I can't be happy unless, or this will finally make me feel. And most importantly, he noticed that every time he believed these stories, suffering followed. Not sometimes, not occasionally, but every single time. The texts tell us that Nanda eventually became an arahant, fully enlightened, completely free from craving. Not because he got what he wanted or because he transcended all desire, but because he understood craving so thoroughly that it lost its power over him. He saw it arising anew. This is just craving. It's not truth. It's not wisdom. It's a conditioned pattern that will create suffering if I believe it and act from it. And in that seeing, in that clear recognition of what craving actually is, freedom became possible. When someone doesn't choose you, you have the same opportunity Nanda had. You can keep feeding the craving, analyzing why they didn't choose you, comparing yourself to whoever they did choose, trying to figure out how to become more acceptable, rehearsing what you should have said or done differently. Or you can start investigating the craving itself. What does it feel like in your body when you're craving their attention, their choice, their validation? Where do you feel it? In your chest, your throat, your stomach? What thoughts come with it? What stories does your mind tell about why this craving is justified or necessary or different from all other cravings? The investigation isn't about making the craving wrong. It's about seeing it clearly. Because what you see clearly loses its power to control you unconsciously. Nanda's freedom didn't come from Janapada Kalyani finally choosing him, or from obtaining celestial nymphs, or from avoiding hell. His freedom came from understanding that all of his suffering, every bit of it, was being created by his relationship to wanting, not by whether he got what he wanted. The moment you understand this in your own experience, something shifts. Not immediately, not dramatically, but definitely. You start to notice craving as it arises, rather than being consumed by it. You start to recognize the difference between genuine care and desperate grasping. You start to see that your peace doesn't actually depend on being chosen. It depends on releasing the insistence that you must be chosen in order to be okay. And once you see that clearly, the path forward becomes obvious. Not easy, but obvious. Because you finally understand what the Buddha was teaching. The problem was never that you weren't chosen. The problem was making being chosen into a requirement for your peace. And requirements, when reality doesn't meet them, create only one thing: suffering. Shortly after his enlightenment, the Buddha was traveling with a group of former fire worshippers who had become his students. These were people who had spent years conducting elaborate rituals around fire, believing that properly tending flames would bring blessings and prevent misfortune. They understood fire intimately, how it starts, what feeds it, how it spreads, how it consumes. They knew that fire was never static, always hungry, always seeking fuel. The Buddha brought them to a hillside and began teaching in language they would understand. "Monks," he said, "all is burning. Not some things, not just certain experiences, all of it. The eye is burning. Forms are burning. Eye consciousness is burning. Eye contact is burning. Whatever feeling arises with eye contact as condition, pleasant, painful, or neither pleasant nor painful, that too is burning." He went through each sense systematically. The ear is burning, sounds are burning. The nose is burning. The tongue is burning. Tastes are burning. The body is burning. Tactile objects are burning. The mind is burning. Thoughts are burning. Everything you experience through your senses, everything you think about, everything you feel, all of it burning. The monks must have felt the weight of this teaching settling over them. They had spent years trying to control external fires, conducting rituals to appease flame, believing that if they just performed the ceremonies correctly, they could prevent burning. Now the Buddha was telling them that the real fire wasn't outside. It was internal, continuous, burning through every moment of experience. Then he asked the question that makes this teaching cut to the core: burning with what? The monks leaned in, waiting. Burning with the fire of greed, with the fire of hatred, with the fire of delusion, burning with birth, aging, and death, with sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. This wasn't poetry. This was description. The Buddha was naming the exact experience of internal burning that every human knows, but rarely understands. And if you've ever chased someone who doesn't choose you, you know exactly what this burning feels like. Your chest burns with longing every time you think about them. Your mind burns with obsessive thinking, analyzing every interaction, every word, every silence. Your body burns with anxiety when you see they've read your message but haven't responded. There's a specific exhaustion that comes from this kind of chasing. Not the physical tiredness of running after something, but the deeper depletion of constantly reaching for what moves away, constantly hoping for what doesn't come, constantly offering yourself to someone who isn't receiving. You check your phone even though you know there won't be a message. You replay conversations looking for signs you might have missed. You adjust your behavior, your appearance, your availability, hoping that if you just get the formula right, they'll finally choose you. And beneath all of this activity is a question that burns. What do I need to do to make them see me? The Buddha's fire sermon reveals something crucial about what's actually happening when you chase. This burning isn't coming from the other person. They're not setting you on fire. You're burning from the inside, from 3 specific fires the Buddha named. The first fire is greed, the grasping, demanding quality of wanting. When you chase someone who doesn't choose you, the greed is obvious. You want them, you crave their attention, you desire their choice. This wanting feels natural, even justified. Of course you want them. They matter to you. You feel connection. You see potential. But greed in the Buddhist sense isn't just wanting. It's the insistence that you must have what you want, the refusal to accept reality when reality says no. You can want something and simultaneously accept that you don't have it. That's disappointment, which is natural and temporary. But greed adds the demand. Reality is wrong for not giving me this, and I will not accept this outcome, and I will keep reaching until I get what I want. That demand keeps the fire burning. Every text you send hoping for a different response, fuel for the fire of greed. Every time you refresh their social media to see what they're doing, more fuel. Every mental rehearsal of what you should have said or could still say, fuel. Every attempt to become more attractive, more interesting, more available, fuel. The fire grows hotter with each addition. You might notice this in your body, the tightness in your chest when you think about them, the restlessness that makes it hard to focus on anything else, the way your heart races when their name appears on your screen. This physical burning is the manifestation of greed working through your system. It's not metaphorical. Your nervous system is actually activated. Your stress hormones are elevated. Your body is in a state of constant reaching. The second fire is hatred, but not in the way you might expect. You might not think you hate the person who doesn't choose you. In fact, you probably believe you care about them deeply. But hatred in Buddhist terms isn't just anger or rage. It's aversion, the pushing away of what is. When you chase someone who doesn't choose you, you're in a constant state of aversion to reality. You're rejecting what's actually happening and insisting it should be different. This rejection burns. It creates a constant friction between what is and what you demand should be. And that friction, that refusal to accept reality as it presents itself, feeds the fire continuously. You can feel this friction in the way your mind argues with itself. One part says, "They're not interested," and another part immediately counters, "But maybe they're just busy," or "Maybe they're afraid," or "Maybe I just need to try one more time." This internal argument is the fire of aversion burning through your mental space. It consumes enormous energy because you're fighting with reality moment by moment, refusing to let things be as they are. Sometimes the aversion turns toward yourself. You hate that you can't let go, hate that you're still thinking about them, hate that you're behaving in ways that feel desperate or undignified. That self-directed aversion is also fuel for the fire. Every time you criticize yourself for still caring, every time you judge yourself for not being over it yet, you're adding another log to the blaze. The third fire is delusion, and this might be the most important of all. Delusion here doesn't mean you're stupid.